The Great Lakes Compact, shield or sieve. Legal walls looked solid until the water started breaking every norm in the playbook. That's when people reached for the document they thought would hold. The Great Lakes, St. Lawrence River Basin Water Resources Compact. 8 states on one side, 2 Canadian provinces aligned by a parallel agreement on the other. The headline promise sounded simple. What's in the basin stays in the basin. No big pipes out. No cavalier drains to thirsty neighbors. A shield, finally. But law lives in definitions. The compact defined its map, the basin line down to parcels, because hydrology doesn't care about city limits. It carved out special categories too. Straddling communities sit with 1 foot inside the basin, 1 out. Straddling counties include places entirely outside the hydrologic line, but tied politically to a county that touches it. And public water supply purposes covers what counts as legitimate use, not just who turns the tap. Those words would matter more than the banner promise. Waukesha, Wisconsin was the test. The city sits outside the basin's hydrologic boundary, but inside a county that touches it, pulling on a stressed aquifer laced with radium. It applied for Lake Michigan water under the compact's exception for straddling counties, promising to return treated water to the lake watershed and limit the service area. After years of review, the governors approved it, with conditions, tight boundaries, strict return flow monitoring. The message was careful. This is not a door, it's a case-by-case key. Still, a precedent clicked. Then there was the bottled water clause. The compact bans most diversions, but treats water in containers under 5.7 gallons as a product, not a diversion, if withdrawn from within the basin and exported out. It sounds technical. On a loading dock, it's pallets of shrink-wrapped bottles headed to markets far from the lakes. Companies argue the volumes are tiny relative to the basin. Critics argue that once water leaves as a product, it's gone for good. No return flow, no accounting in the hydrologic books. The loophole is legal, and it's real. Enforcement looks tough on paper. Most major diversions require unanimous consent from the governors. In practice, politics pushes on unanimity. States want jobs, companies promise investments. A governor facing drought headlines in another region will take calls. Penalties exist, but they're modest compared to the value at stake in an era when dry reservoirs make front pages. The compact's drafters bet on cooperation, stress tests cooperation. During low water years or bloom seasons that shut intakes, calls get louder. Lawmakers outside the basin float trial balloons, resolutions, op-eds, think tank maps of pipelines arcing east to west. Most die fast. The elevation climb over the Rockies is brutal. Pumping costs stack up. Evaporation loss along a hot, open canal is a leak you pay for forever, but drought changes arithmetic. A 1,000-mile fantasy feels less fantastical when a city's last reservoir shows bathtub rings and a desal plan runs late. Inside the basin, mayors and tribal leaders watch Waukesha closely because it proved something else. The compact is only as tight as its definitions and the willingness to hold them. Public water supply purposes sound civic, households, hospitals, schools, but in an era of giant industrial campuses, the line blurs. A city can extend service to a chip fab or data center outside the basin line if the legal hook fits. Return flow conditions help, but they don't erase pressure. Canada's side runs on a mirror track with differences that matter. Provinces hold a stronger hand than states do relative to their federal government. Ontario and Quebec have their own bans on bulk removals, born from bruising fights in the 1990s over proposed water exports. The memory of those proposals hardened political reflexes, say no first. Still, product language lives there too. And trade agreements hover as a specter. Lawyers argue about whether water, in its natural state, is protected from being treated as a commodity. Nobody wants to test that in court with the lakes as Exhibit A. So is the compact a shield or a sieve? It's both, depending on pressure. As long as basin states and provinces hold the line on definitions, narrow service areas, real return flows, true public uses, the shield holds. The sieve shows where policy invited it. Bottled water exemptions, straddling county carve-outs, penalties that assume good faith in a hard decade. The stakes are simple. Drought-era pressure will pry at every seam. If the loopholes become practices, the precedent becomes policy. And policy is hard to reverse once the pipes are in the ground. The West is running out and looking east. While governors passed definitions, a drumbeat from 2,000 miles away got louder. The Colorado River, America's most litigated creek, ran short, not a blip. A structural shortfall baked in by a century of paper promises that exceeded real water. Reservoirs that once looked endless dropped to bathtub rings and boat ramps on dust. Lake Mead and Lake Powell, icons of the West's bargain with aridity, hit levels where hydropower sputtered and emergency rules kicked in. Cities and irrigation districts carved cuts they'd sworn were impossible. Farmers fallowed fields for payments that didn't cover the math. States argued over who owed what under compacts written when the river ran fatter. Junior users stared at shutoff notices while senior rights holders stared at crop insurance forms. Meanwhile, heat kept rising. Snowpack thinned and melted early. Rivers peaked weeks ahead of the old calendar, then trickled when demand spiked. It wasn't just drought, it was a new baseline. In that pressure cooker, maps started appearing. Op-eds with arrows, statehouse hearings with glossy renderings of pipelines arcing from the Great Lakes to the desert. Some were laugh lines, like a straw across the plains pulling Superior into Phoenix. Others wrapped themselves in feasibility studies. Water boosters talked about swaps, ship Midwest water west, and send Western power east. Engineers rolled eyes at the head lift over mountains. Pumping water uphill that far turns into an electricity bill that never ends. Even a buried pipe leaks to heat and friction. Open canals gift water to the sky. Still, drought makes bad ideas look respectable. Legislatures floated resolutions urging exploration of Great Lakes diversions. Think pieces called the Compact Parochial in a national emergency. Comment sections filled with people asking why a region with so much could say no to a region with so little. It sounded moral until you looked at hydrology and law. The Great Lakes aren't a hose you can open and forget. Withdrawals have to return to the basin to keep levels steady. The compact was written because without it, every crisis would arrive with a truckload of pumps. Western cities ran their own math. Phoenix looked at desalination in Mexico, where a Gulf plant could pair with a water swap up the Colorado versus importing from the east. Las Vegas, already a case study in reuse, stretched conservation like an art form. Cash for lawns, strict outdoor use rules, effluent polish to feed Lake Mead again. Import schemes cost in the hundreds of billions, with decades-long timelines and political risk at every border. Desal costs too, but it's local and certain once built. A pipeline fantasy might buy a headline, a desal plant buys control. Even so, the Great Lakes kept showing up in speeches, not because a pipe was imminent, but because the lakes had become a symbol, a national lifeline locked behind regional gates. Midwest leaders answered with a chorus, never. Governors and premiers held joint presses, flexed the compact, promised legal war over any grab. That was the public line. The private murmur was softer. Jobs and deals talk crept in when chip fabs and battery plants pitched billion-dollar campuses. If a city outside the line wanted lake water through a straddling county clause and promised 10,000 jobs, would the chorus hold the same note? Basin communities felt besieged not just by the West, but by narratives that treated their water as excess. A mayor in a small Michigan town read a column calling the Great Lakes America's emergency reservoir and thought about boil orders after storms and rate hikes to replace lead lines. Excess felt like a joke. Meanwhile, bottled water plants bought land near cold springs and drilled permits through quiet boards. Trucks rolled outbound for stores in states that tweeted about diversions. Export was already happening, just shrink-wrapped and legal. Farm belts in the West added another pressure. Almonds, alfalfa, and lettuce ride east on trucks and trains to feed cattle and people in the basin. When water gets tight there, prices ripple here. The Midwest's claim that it already exports water embedded in food got louder. If the basin feeds the West, the argument went, maybe the West should fix its own plumbing before asking for ours. It wasn't a snub, it was a boundary. Conservation, reuse, desalination, and cropping changes sit inside a Western toolkit with proven results. The Great Lakes don't need to be tool number 5. Politics turned testy along party lines and didn't. Western Republicans who praised local control asked the Midwest for federal solutions. Midwestern Democrats who speechify about national solidarity pointed to tribal treaties and provincial laws. Tribal nations in the basin added weight. Treaties recognize fishing and water rights that predate states. Any talk of diversions that skip their consent isn't just rude, it's illegal. That fact resets certain fantasies before they reach committee. Here's the quiet pivot. Even without a pipe, pressure from the West shapes decisions in the basin. Companies pitch growth as national security, chips, batteries, data centers, wrapped in jobs, and they all need water. If basin leaders grant those, they lower their moral leverage against Western asks. A community that approves a thirsty campus in a straddling suburb will struggle to look a desert governor in the eye and say no. The narrative bleeds into the next fight, which crosses a border not on land, but in the water itself. Cross-border tensions, two nations, one basin. While the West floated pipelines on paper, another tension line ran straight through the water. The US-Canada border doesn't sit on land here, it slices lakes and rivers. That means every argument about diversions, pollution, and levels has a twin across the line. The treaty that's supposed to keep the peace is old and sturdy, the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty, and it birthed a referee, the International Joint Commission. The IJC studies, recommends, convenes. It doesn't command armies. Its power is moral, technical, and patient. The treaty's backbone is simple: don't cause injury to the other side. In practice, injury turns into hearings and hydrologic models. The IJC can approve projects that affect flows or water levels across the line, dams, diversions, and set conditions. It can run public boards where citizens from Sault Ste. Marie to Cornwall weigh in on gate settings and sea lamprey control. But it can't force a governor to say yes to a pipeline or a premier to shut a plant. The Commission's leverage is sunlight and credibility. That's where asymmetry creeps in. In the US, the compact ties 8 governors together. In Canada, provinces hold the keys to water. Ottawa sets broad rules, signs treaties, and funds programs, but Queen's Park in Ontario and Quebec City in Quebec issue permits and say no to bulk removals. That split changes the chessboard. When a US state entertains a straddling community request, its dance partners are other governors. When a Canadian bottler applies for a groundwater permit near a Great Lakes tributary, the provincial environment minister answers to a provincial caucus. Trade law hovers like a storm cloud. NAFTA is gone, replaced by USMCA, but the fight over whether water is a good never fully died. Both countries carved out language saying water, in its natural state, isn't a tradable commodity. Move it into containers, pipe it into a facility, bottle it, and the gray begins. Investors watch for signals. Governments insist sovereignty is intact. Lawyers prepare for a case nobody wants to be the test. Canada has scars from skirmishes that never quite became wars. In the late 198s and 199s, companies pitched bulk export schemes from Ontario and Newfoundland, tankers filled with lake or bay water bound for Asia. Public outrage was swift. Parliament and provinces slammed doors with laws that banned bulk removals. Those fights hardened a reflex. When the word export appears, say no first and pause later. The memory sits just under the surface. Whenever a bottled water plant adds a line or a drought headline from Arizona crosses a Canadian news feed. On both sides, First Nations and tribal nations reset the conversation. Treaty rights to fish, hunt, and use the water aren't historical footnotes, they're living law. In the US, tribes co-manage fisheries, sit on IJC advisory boards, and assert consent on projects that touch treaty resources. In Canada, First Nations assert Aboriginal and treaty rights, and courts increasingly require meaningful consultation and accommodation. When they say water is a relative, not a resource, it's not metaphor, it's governance. A diversion that ignores those rights isn't just controversial, it's vulnerable in court. Case studies show what that means. When Waukesha's application moved, tribal governments weighed in on return flow and downstream impacts. When a bottler sought to expand near a cold water creek in Ontario, local First Nations pointed to cumulative effects on base flow and fish. Municipal councils that might once have treated water permits as paperwork started holding night-long hearings. The public learned words like aquifer drawdown and cumulative hydrologic impact because elders, anglers, and engineers stood at the same microphones. Meanwhile, binational files simmered. In Bridges Line 5 pipeline runs under the Straits of Mackinac, a pinch point where Lakes Michigan and Huron trade water like lungs. One leak, there would slosh oil through both countries' coasts in hours. Michigan moved to revoke an easement. Tribes backed the move. Canada invoked a 1977 treaty on transit pipelines. Courtrooms became the venue for a fight with no simple border. The lesson was brutal. Energy and water infrastructure share tight spaces, and jurisdiction is a maze. The IJC tries to keep trust alive in that maze. It runs reference studies on nutrient loads to Lake Erie, calls for phosphorus reductions both countries sign and miss, and convenes after-action reviews when floods hammer Montreal or Lake Ontario shorelines. Its reports carry weight because they're careful and boring in the best way: data, context, options. But when storms intensify and politics sharpen, advice can feel soft next to a backhoe. Diplomatic strain is the risk if diversions or bulk removal workarounds move without alignment. A governor greenlighting water for a straddling industry near the line could find Ontario's premier in front of cameras, promising to challenge. A provincial permit that looks generous to a bottler could spark a U.S. congressional letter and calls for tariffs that don't fit the facts. The basin doesn't need that theater. It needs quiet, synchronized constraints. Indigenous rights change the terms in a more durable way. When tribal nations and First Nations assert co-governance over fisheries, shoreline restoration, or nutrient targets, the basin gains another layer of no to reckless moves and another layer of yes to stewardship. That doesn't slow everything, it slows shortcuts. And as both sides of the border pour money into climate and infrastructure, those rights force projects to fit the water, not the other way around. Even without exports, the economy already depends on water in motion, or grain, energy, threaded through locks and canals that ignore politics until politics breaks them. That's the next reality check: how a $6 trillion engine runs on locks built for a calmer century. The $6 trillion engine: trade, energy, and food. The basin isn't just water, it's a machine. Ore moves down from Superior's iron ranges, grain up from prairie elevators, aggregates from quarries to concrete plants that pour the region's bones. The Great Lakes, St. Lawrence system is a wet highway, and every lock is a toll booth time can't ignore. Start at the Sioux. 2 parallel locks stitch Lake Superior's height to the lower lakes. The Poe lock is the big one, the only chamber long and deep enough for the 1,000-foot ore carriers that feed blast furnaces from Detroit to Burns Harbor. That's a single point of failure hiding in plain sight. If the Poe goes down for more than days, furnaces idle. When furnaces idle, rolling mills go quiet, and auto plants feel it by the end of the week. There's a plan on paper for a second Poe-sized lock, but until steel and concrete become gates and walls, captains say quiet prayers every transit. Through Huron and down into the St. Clair-Detroit corridor, freighters thread between refineries and power stations that sip and spit water by the cubic mile. Intake permits set volumes and temperatures. Discharge permits set limits on heat, metals, and chlorine residuals. On good days, it's routine. On hot days, it's a negotiation with physics. A heat wave pushes river temperatures up, and suddenly a plant's waste heat threatens to tip fish kills. Operators throttle output or beg regulators for temporary variances. Neither choice is free. Lake Erie carries a different mix: grain, limestone, cement, salt, moving east and west through ports that doubled as industrial hearts for a century. Grain doesn't care about glamour, it cares about timing. Elevators must hit export windows or lose premiums. A silted channel that waits 2 weeks for a dredge is a contract penalty waiting to happen. Limestone feeds steel, salt feeds winter roads. A ship stuck behind a wind-driven seiche isn't a trivia fact. It's a county's de-icing plan, wobbling as a storm front builds. Out on Lake Michigan, bulk terminals load sand and stone for concrete that fixes bridges and builds factories. Chicago's river reversal still funnels barge traffic into the system, a reminder that the canals we built to move waste now move everything. A jam at a Chicago drawbridge ripples to a cement pour in Milwaukee and a runway rehab in Grand Rapids. Logistics managers watch wind forecasts like fishermen. Slide to Ontario, and the St. Lawrence Seaway opens the Midwest to the ocean. Salty's smaller ocean-going ships carry specialty steel, wind turbine blades, project cargo that won't fit on a train. When lake levels run low, they lighten loads to clear channels. When levels run high, They worry about bridge clearance and lock safety in storms that toss whitewater into chambers built for calmer days. Seaway closures aren't hypothetical. Ice and maintenance windows are hard stops. Add climate whiplash to that schedule, and the margin shrinks. Industry runs on that cadence. A steel mill takes ore, flux, coal, and water and turns it into heat and shape. Miss a delivery, and you either pay to stockpile or pay to shut down. A refinery blends crude streams delivered by pipeline and ship, trims sulfur to meet rules, and uses lake water to cool towers the size of cathedrals. Turn down the intake, and output drops. A nuclear plant safety case assumes stable intake depths and manageable thermal discharge. An unexpected algae surge or low water event can force an unplanned outage.